You're probably watching this video because you were really curious like me and trying to get a solid understanding about the rapture and the second coming. Like me, you've waded through a sea of videos and teachings where preachers attempt to interpret Daniel and Revelation with far-out predictions that have all failed the test of time. I'm not going to go there. There's no need to do that because Jesus spoke very clearly, and I'm going to fill in the blanks of history that preachers have missed. And I guarantee that if you hold evidence and truth in a high esteem like I do, your mind is going to be absolutely blown by this. You won't be able to stay quiet about it. And there were things that were just not adding up about things that I had studied over time, and I kind of put them in the back burner of my mind. But then I heard about the writings of this historian, and it all clicked. It suddenly made perfect sense. Now, let's first establish how the word Bible is used in the church, because we're going to be using it a lot, and I think people have a kind of a skewed idea of really what it is. The church is not a building, it's not a denomination. The term simply means Christ's followers, sometimes referred to as the body of Christ, or in some cases the bride. But it's the people. It's not a building, anything else like that. In the first century, people met in homes. And that was the church, people meeting in homes, no matter what city they were in. There was never any kind of directive to form giant organizations nor build buildings with steeples. The home church, the church, it's just a great way to come together that way. But believers' marching orders were to go forth, not to build buildings. And clearly you'll see that by Jesus' own words, there was an urgency for preparations that didn't allow for that. Second, what's been termed the rapture is completely different, a completely different event than the second coming. In the rapture, the church, which are the followers, are removed from the earth. Kind of like when God removed Noah's family from the land and returned them later. Paul, in fact, made comparisons in Peter 3, starting in verse 21. He says, God kept waiting in the days of Noah during the construction of the ark, in which a few, that is, 8 persons, were brought safely through the water. Corresponding to that, baptism now saves you. Isn't it interesting that even though God destroyed the world, his intention was always to put man back on the earth? And that's going to be key to kind of what we're getting into here. So the Bible says in the second coming, God's church, meaning his full body of believers again, returns to the earth. So you see the difference there is that one is taking away the believers from what we're going to see is a situation, and the other one is all the believers, the church coming back with Christ. And there's nothing else to after that, presumably, or not presumably, but anything after that is really spoken about that relates to the rapture and the second coming. But I don't want to get into all those scriptures here that separate the many differences between rapture and the second coming. Perhaps I will make a video later on that, or there are others that you can find out there on the internet that have done a really good job of it, kind of breaking it down and delineating between the two. But let's stay on target here. So there's a removal and a return, which includes a New Jerusalem descending from heaven upon the second coming. Now, we all know that Jesus died and rose on the third day. But why didn't I see this ever before? Look at Matthew 27, verses 52 and 53. The tombs were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they entered the holy city and appeared to many. Now, since Jesus had conquered death and now had a glorified body, do we have any reason to think that those that were the resurrected saints were not in the same likeness of his death? I mean, that's kind of the whole point of it, wasn't it? So that makes them immortal at this point. We don't have any reason to think otherwise. It wouldn't make sense, however, to resurrect them just for them to die again. It would mean Jesus died. Jesus didn't conquer death once and for all. And like Hebrews chapter 9, 27 says, it is appointed once unto man death, after that judgment. Okay? So clearly there is no other outcome that can happen in this context. There are no bodily resurrections in the Old Testament, but there are references in such places like in Daniel 12 that speak of a time of such great distress that the world had never seen, and to that point that those who sleep in the dust shall arise. Again, I don't want to get into all the interpretations there, but that's kind of a very clear picture that's kind of reinforcing what Jesus said. So when Jesus ascended into clouds in heaven, there was no mention of these resurrected saints accompanying him. I don't think the writers just simply forgot to say that. So what happened to these resurrected followers? Well, either they are still here on earth and hiding for some reason, or they ascended to heaven at a different time. So this got me to thinking, why do we assume the rapture will start and conclude all in one stage, all in an instant, when the scripture kind of depicts something different? There's no biblical basis that states how long it will take, but it does indicate it's a process. Look at Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 15 through 17. For this we say to you by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord will not precede those who have fallen asleep. For the Lord himself will will descend from heaven, and with a shout, the voice of the archangel, and the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive and remain will be brought up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. So this process starts with the dead rising first. Then those who remain will be caught up with Jesus. Not on the earth, but in the air. He isn't returning to set down on the earth yet during the rapture. I want you to take note of two things here. Number one, it's strange to point out alive and remain. It's an emphasizing something. Remain after what? Number two, note the sound of the trumpet. It will be an important marker later on in this video. Okay, so let's set this point aside for a moment and come back to it, and I'll kind of all tie it together. There's another thing that bothered me for a long time also. I'm going to read from Matthew 24. I'm going to be skipping over a bit just for the sake of clarity. And that's kind of the only time I'll do that I'll get into interpretations a bit, but you'll see why. Matthew 24, verse 5. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet. Let me pause for a minute. This term abomination of desolation is a word picture, or a word phrase picture in this case. Because a picture is kind of worth 1,000 words, isn't it? It was used by Daniel 3 times describing events of his time, which included stopping the burnt offering sacrifices in the temple. And there was a character called TACTIUS IV, who was a Syrian king who took the title God Manifest, or as he was like saying, look at me, I'm God. Antiochus, like Nero, and later Titus, the Roman general in 70 AD, also slaughtered thousands of Jews, basically attempting to rid the world of Jews and their religion that honored God. We can see that history often repeats in modern era, such as the Nazis and the Germans attempting to rid the world of Jews. So basically, abomination of desolation is a way of saying history is going to repeat itself. Today, it would be like saying there's going to be another 9/11. Well, 2,000 or 3,000 years from now, most people aren't going to know what the heck 9/11 means anymore. Just as us Christians wouldn't really understand the abomination of desolation unless we are really studying Bible history like a scholar of things that were going on 2,000 to 4,000 years ago. So let me continue, starting in verse 5. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which is spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. So this word picture tells us that a very similar scenario is going to happen to Christians, and they should run. Continuing in verse 17, skipping down a bit. Who is ever on the housetops must not go down to get things out that are in the house. Whoever is in the fields must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those that are nursing babies in those days. But pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on the Sabbath. For then there will be such great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will be. Let me stop for a minute. The word tribulation simply means persecutions. And if you want to go back and look at this in the Greek and interlinear, persecution is used interchangeably with tribulation. I don't know why people, translators, chose to use tribulation, but don't get hung up on the word. It means just simply persecution. So continuing, unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Okay, let me skip down to 27 for a minute. For just as lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the coming be of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, excuse me, there the vultures will gather. But immediately after the tribulation, or after the persecutions of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then the Son of Man, which is Jesus, will appear in the sky. And then all tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. Now, let me stop again here. I had always assumed that the mourning would be those realizing it was too late to join with Christ now, and Christ is going to come to destroy them. But the meaning is to grieve over someone's death. So it's the believers who are being removed from the earth that are grieving over those that didn't choose God. Your friends, your family, your brother, your sister, your best friend. I mean, can you imagine that? It's going to be very sad. I mean, on one hand, you're going to see Jesus in the sky, and it's like, this is something you've been hoping for forever and ever and ever. But on the other hand, you're leaving those behind that just didn't warm up to Christ. So why is what I'm reading now so important about the rapture and the second coming? We're going to see in just a few minutes here. Let me continue. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. Now I'll skip down to 34 here for a minute. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Now this last sentence is one of those that has always bothered me for a long time also. It sounds pretty clear that everyone living then was not going to die before this great event was going to conclude. Was Jesus lying? Was he mistaken? So it made sense when every teacher and every preacher I've ever heard said, no, the original Greek means just Jews. It's talking about a race, these teachers have said. So I went back to the Greek interlinear Bible and saw that the word used for generation here was the word genea in Greek. Genea is used 32 times in the New Testament and always used in the context of people of that time only. It never is used to refer to race. If he wanted to talk about Jews, he would have just said something more precise like the sons of Israel or you Hebrews. But let me give you an example of how clearly genea, that is generations, is used without room for misinterpretations. In Matthew 17, so it says, so all generations, all genea, from Abraham to David are 14 generations. All right, so that's pretty clear. He's not talking about a race of different people. He's talking about different time periods of lives of being born and dying. Or you could take Hebrews chapter 3, verses 9 and 10, for instance. And this is Greek quoting from the Hebrew that is written in the Old Testament regarding Israelites in the desert. Where your fathers tried me by testing me and saw my works for 40 years, therefore I was very angry with this generation. Again, this genea. It's clear it would be a huge assumption and a theological backflip to believe Jesus was talking about just a race of people. And I hate to say it, but this misinterpretation pushed by so many pastors and teachers is a lie started by the devil. And we just don't realize it. And of course, the devil is always trying to insert himself in the middle of preachers and teachers and misinterpreting it. And that's a major part of the Bible. The New Testament is just talking about how things have gotten screwed up in traditions. You can just read it all through the New Testament. So let me pick up here. So these 2 points that have bothered me. One, what happened to those that were resurrected at the time of Christ? And two, Jesus stating plainly that people of that time were not going to die until a time of great distress took place. What bothered me even more, now arriving at these conclusions, was something else that I had to consider. Why is there a sudden stop, a complete absence of any more letters from the apostles and all the younger followers of Christ around 70 AD? Why does it stop there? I mean, Timothy was pretty young, and there were, of course, a lot of younger writers that could have continued teaching. Excuse me. So, in other words, why did the Bible end there with no other further letters of encouragement? No more prophecies, no more letters of admonishing the church at its different locations. So I started to study what was happening then. And it turns out that a group of Jewish rebels started a revolt against the Romans, and it became known as the War of the Jews. According to the most reputable, famous historian, his name was Flavius Josephus. He was a non-Christian, but he was a Roman-born Jew historian who fought in the war between getting many of the accounts from first-hand witnesses, starting from about 66 AD, and accounts of things that he actually saw as well, and he experienced, because he was a fighter. He was fighting in that as well. So this small rebellion in 66 AD starts to escalate into a massive scale, a systematic slaughtering machine of the Romans moving across the Holy Lands, finding Jews and Christians where they'd be looking for them everywhere, and just picture hundreds of thousands of troops moving so that there was no escape, trying to get past these massive lines. So they're searching for Christians and Jews. So from 68 AD to 70 AD, Joseph estimates that over 100 million, actually 100 million, 100 and, how do I say this? 1,100,000 people were slaughtered. It culminates in the Romans surrounding the temple fortress and destroying it. So if you ever wondered about, okay, well, what happened to the temple? I've never learned about that, other than the Romans destroyed it at some point. Well, now you know exactly when it happened. This nastiness of the Romans is just unparalleled at this point. I mean, hacking to death, cutting off heads of children and women and men, just blood-stained everywhere. Bodies piled everywhere. Can you imagine 1 million plus bodies just laying everywhere and decapitations? It's just vicious, a vicious, unparalleled slaughter. And just this history and time is something, such a great persecution. I mean, it's a great tribulation. It's a great persecution. So why didn't the Christians keep on writing after this? Were they all killed, or just too afraid to come out of hiding ever again? Well, then I saw the accounts of Josephus around Jerusalem that happened during his 7-year period from 66 to 73 AD. And I'm going to read this, what he wrote. A certain prodigious and incredible phenomenon appeared. Now, let me back up for a minute. Keep in mind, this is a Jew. This is not a Christian, a follower of Christ. He's way on the outside, and he believes that he's fighting against the Romans, and he's taking account of this. So, a certain prodigious and incredible phenomenon appeared, I suppose the account of it would seem to be a fable, were it not related by those who saw it, of so considerable in nature as to deserve such signals. For before sun setting, chariots and troops of soldiers in their armor were seen running among the clouds and surrounding the cities. Moreover, at the feast, which we call Pentecost, as the priests were going by night into the inner court of the temple, as was their custom, to perform their sacred ministrations, they said that in the first place they felt a quaking and heard a great noise, and after that they heard a sound of a multitude saying, "Let us remove hence." So there's another historian as well called TACTIUS, and he's a Roman historian also. He relates a very similar event at the destruction of Jerusalem. He says, "As I, TACTIUS, am about to relate to the days of the famous city Jerusalem, prodigies had occurred. There had been seen hosts joining battles in the sky, and a fiery gleam of arms, the temple illuminated by a sudden radiance from the clouds. The doors of the inner shrine of the temple were suddenly thrown open, and a voice more than the mortal tone of a man was heard to cry that the gods were departing. At the same instant there was a mighty stir as a departure. Some few put a fearful meaning on these events, but in most there was a firm persuasion that in the ancient records of their priest was contained a prediction on how this very time the East was going to grow powerful, and the rulers coming from Judea were to acquire universal empire," unquote. So he's referring to the writings of Daniel here. Remember, these were historians that did not know Jesus' teaching. There was no Bible at the time, and they weren't, let's say, they weren't hanging out with Christians. Is it possible that they witnessed the rapture and just didn't know what it was? I mean, remember the trumpet and the voice saying, "Let us remove"? So, more so, the devil has been given charge over this world. What better way to discourage us believers than that Jesus believers would learn of Jesus much later through the letters of the apostles, than to hide the truth of them, that Jesus told the truth, that he came back in the clouds, in the air, and saved his followers from this great persecution, this hell on earth, as God's holy city was attacked and destroyed. Remember, that's what that's what the Romans zeroed in on. But it came from a massive, massive legion that marched from country to country. Those left behind were those that rejected the truth. They were not apt to report what they hated. Why would they do that? Why would they say, "Oh, we witnessed these great things in the sky, and hey, there doesn't seem to be any Christians around anymore"? Why would they report that if they love lies and they rejected God? Doesn't it all make much more sense? Don't you feel great knowing that everything happened just as Jesus said, and that he's going to return in the second coming this time to reclaim the world for us? He's going to bring back all those Christians that he saved from those millions of people that were slaughtered, or that 1,100,000 that were slaughtered. We were never meant to be disembodied souls floating in heaven. That's the homeland of the angels. He put us humans in the garden to begin with and created us to breathe air. He'll set down the New Jerusalem one day, creating a new heaven and a new earth again. But now, you can go back and look at Daniel and Revelation and the tribulation period surrounding the rapture. It will all make sense. Don't get tripped up on things like trying to fit the 3.5 years regarding the rapture tribulation period into a literal context. As you know, God uses 7s and 12s throughout the Bible. They are his perfect numbers. And 3.5 is a way to say that his perfect plan is halfway there. Think of God as a bit of a poet. So if you're like me, you're going to hear this and think, yeah, that all sounds good. I'm having a hard time digesting that. I've thought this way for a certain way in my life, and gonna have to think about it. Me, it took a long, long time to digest this and realize that this makes a lot more sense than all the failed prophecies of Hal Lindsey and all the different people through decades and decades and decades that have tried to take all Daniel and Revelation and try to contort them into something, and these things about generation means race. It doesn't mean that it's all going to happen at a different time. It's going to happen then. So, anyways, thank you for watching, and I hope you'll go out and tell other people about this, and you'll study it yourself. You can easily find the writings of Josephus and TACTIUS online. And there's some great documentaries about the War of the Jews that happened in the late 60, 80, and in through the 70, 80 period. Don't take my word for it.